In 1941, things turned disastrous for Nazi Germany. After launching their invasion of the Soviet Union in June, they believed they could crush the Red Army within 6 weeks. Adolf Hitler had confidently claimed, "All we need to do is kick in the door, and the entire decaying system will collapse." But his prediction proved completely wrong. By December, German troops had been stopped right outside Moscow, and soon after were pushed back by the Soviet winter counterattack. And the situation grew even worse. Germany had earlier depended on the Soviets themselves for essential raw materials. But now that they were fighting their former partner, those crucial supplies were running out. The most serious blow came in December 1941, when the United States joined the war on the Allied side. Above all, Hitler dreaded the possibility of fighting on two fronts, especially against the massive industrial strength of the United States. His chance to secure victory was quickly slipping away. To overcome the United States and its overwhelming industrial strength, Hitler believed he had to defeat the Soviet Union as fast as possible. Germany's relentless hunger for natural resources was one of the main motivations behind its eastern offensive. Oil was especially vital, and Germany simply did not have enough of it. For Hitler, the vast oil reserves in the southern Caucasus were the key to ultimate victory. Without capturing them, he felt the war was unwinnable. The struggle to seize those oil fields would eventually lead to the deadliest confrontation of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. Yet even though many view Stalingrad as the war's turning point, the fate of the battle may have been sealed long before German forces even arrived at the city. To understand why, we must return to the very beginning of the plan. The German army that marched into the Soviet Union in 1941 was enormous, the largest invading force ever assembled up to that time. But 1 year later, that same army was spread thin across an immense front stretching more than 2,500 kilometers. Army Group North was fully engaged in the siege of Leningrad, while Army Group Center faced relentless Soviet attacks near the city of Rzhev. As a result, for what was supposed to be a decisive, war-winning offensive, Army Group South could gather only 72 German divisions, roughly 1 million troops. The operation, known as Fall Blau or Case Blue, was designed to unfold in phases. The first step required Axis forces to break through Soviet defensive lines. The plan called for the capture of Voronezh and the encirclement of Soviet troops in eastern Ukraine. Once those forces were destroyed, Army Group South was to divide into two separate formations. Army Group B would push toward Astrakhan to establish a defensive barrier along the Don and Volga rivers, while Army Group A would swing south toward the oil-producing regions of Maykop and Grozny. After securing the fertile lands of eastern Ukraine and the valuable oil fields of the Caucasus, Hitler believed Germany would finally possess the resources needed to continue the war, and eventually challenge the United States. At the same time, by cutting the Soviet Union off from these essential materials, he hoped the Soviet military would collapse the following year. Although the strategy seemed solid on paper, it had several serious weaknesses. Operation Blau faced major problems from the start. The German supply system was already pushed to its limits. The distances they intended to advance were enormous, and Germany lacked the manpower and equipment required to take and hold such vast areas. Because of this, Hitler had to bolster his army with troops from his allies, primarily Romanians and Italians. While these Allied units were large in number, they were far less well equipped. For instance, they did not possess powerful weapons like the German Flak 88 gun, a highly effective anti-tank weapon positioned behind me. Hitler, once again, had badly misjudged his enemy. The Soviets were capable of fielding more than 1 million additional soldiers compared to the Germans, and they were constantly forming new air units and armored formations. Turning Operation Blue into a success would be extremely difficult. On June 28, 1942, Operation Blau was launched. The Germans expected strong Soviet resistance, but Stalin still believed the next major assault would target Moscow, leaving his southern forces relatively under strength. When the Germans advanced, the Red Army fell back rapidly, part retreat, part chaotic collapse. Within just over a week, the Germans had taken Voronezh, and it appeared that Soviet troops in the south were on the brink of complete destruction. Phase 2 began on July 9, ahead of the planned timeline, as German units pushed toward Rostov and the Great Curve of the Don River. Here, they intended to trap and annihilate Soviet forces. But the Red Army kept withdrawing, leaving the German encirclement empty-handed. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Adolf Hitler grew increasingly anxious about the Western Allies launching a second front. In fact, Allied forces would land at Dieppe on the French coast only weeks later. Yet now, watching the Red Army seemingly falling apart, Hitler believed that nothing stood between him and his ultimate strategic goals. Thus, on July 23, 1942, he altered the plan for Operation Blau. A decision that would ultimately reshape the course of the entire war. Both army groups were ordered to pursue their objectives simultaneously. As Army Group A surged toward the Caucasus, Army Group B received a new mission. Before establishing the defensive barrier from Astrakhan along the Don River, Friedrich von Paulus's 6th Army was now expected to capture the city of Stalingrad. From this position, they would be able to intercept Soviet oil shipments traveling up the Volga River. Dividing his forces in this manner was extremely dangerous, but Hitler was so certain of success that he even pulled units away from Army Group South and redirected them to Army Group Center and North. The soldiers left to carry out the revised orders faced severe hardship. Because food supplies in Germany were shrinking and transporting rations to the front was becoming harder. The German troops in the east were expected to survive largely by living off the land. However, the destruction or lack of crops and other food sources made this nearly impossible, even with harsh requisitioning from the local rural population. The 6th Army had already resorted to eating its horses long before reaching Stalingrad. Despite all these difficulties, Army Group A continued advancing quickly, because only scattered Soviet resistance stood in their way. By August 10, they arrived at the Makop oil fields only to discover that the wells had been demolished by Soviet engineers. Rebuilding them would require considerable time. Army Group B, in contrast, encountered far greater obstacles. They became bogged down by supply shortages and by Soviet forces that were finally reorganizing. The Red Army stopped Paulus's troops for 3 weeks, suffering horrific losses, but also wearing down the German formations in return. This slowdown forced Hitler to shift additional units from Army Group A to accelerate the offensive. Only once these reinforcements arrived could the 6th Army continue its push forward. After crossing the Don River on August 23, they reached the northern outskirts of Stalingrad and were about to face the most brutal battle of their entire campaign. The responsibility for defending Stalingrad was assigned to the 62nd Army, led by General Vasily Chukov, a seasoned veteran of the Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland at the beginning of World War II. Chukov had experienced the humiliating defeat of his 9th Army firsthand. Determined to prove himself to Stalin, he made it his mission that Stalingrad would not fall into German hands. As the battle for the city commenced, a significant portion of Stalingrad's civilian population remained behind. Living, and often dying, among the ruins of their homes, the people of Stalingrad shared in the Red Army's struggle. The stage was set for one of the most desperate confrontations of the entire war. The Battle of Stalingrad opened with a massive bombardment of the city, reducing much of it to rubble. While this caused terrible civilian casualties, it failed to destroy the city's defenses and actually created new problems for the attackers. The shattered buildings and debris-filled streets slowed the German advance and gave the Soviet defenders a significant advantage. For the Germans, Stalingrad represented their first true experience of urban combat, a stark contrast to the blitzkrieg tactics that had carried them across Europe. In this environment, the Red Army proved far more skilled in urban warfare. Soviet snipers competed fiercely to inflict maximum losses on German troops. More than the actual casualties, the snipers' greatest impact was the fear they instilled among the German soldiers, making them hesitant to move in the open during daylight hours. By the end of September, the city had become a grinding, bloody battlefield, its devastation carrying enormous propaganda value for the Soviets. Hitler became increasingly obsessed with capturing the city, committing ever more soldiers to the battle. At the same time, Stalin himself was willing to absorb enormous losses to ensure that his city would not fall. Outside Stalingrad, the Red Army launched continuous counterattacks. Although these assaults failed to break through, they gradually stretched the Axis forces ever thinner. Further to the south, Army Group A also encountered fierce Soviet resistance. With the majority of its aircraft redirected to support operations at Stalingrad, the Soviet Air Force gained the advantage in the skies. The greatest challenge, however, lay in logistics, which plagued all of Army Group South. Only 3 single-track railways led to Stalingrad, and none were fully converted to German gauge. Even operating at maximum capacity, the rail lines became heavily congested, leaving long queues of trains waiting to reach the city. As a result, the 6th Army suffered severe shortages of ammunition, food, fuel, and spare parts for tanks and aircraft. Paulus was effectively constrained. He desperately needed more troops to capture the city, yet he could barely supply the forces he already commanded. This, however, was not a problem for the Soviets. Contrary to expectations, Zhukov's troops received substantial reinforcements, supplies, and war material across the Volga River. This crucial lifeline allowed the 62nd Army to maintain its defense of the city. Meanwhile, the Germans could not match these replacements or supplies. They were at a disadvantage in other ways as well. Their tanks were both fewer in number and technically inferior to Soviet T-34s, like the one positioned behind me. Our tank here is a later model, yet its characteristic sloped armor remains visible, providing improved protection while using thinner armor plates. Hitler's own armored warfare experts considered it the finest tank they had ever faced. As winter set in, Army Groups A and B were beginning to lose momentum. The Luftwaffe had to focus on bombing the oil fields at Grozny to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Meanwhile, the 6th Army in Stalingrad was utterly exhausted, with units operating on minimal supplies. By mid-November, however, they had seized roughly 90% of the city, while Soviet forces stubbornly held on to narrow strips of land along the Volga River. Conditions were dire for everyone involved. Here we have a collection of letters, photographs, and other documents from Fritz Leuteritz, a German soldier fighting in Stalingrad. Like many of his fellow troops hiding underground, he recounted how they tried to celebrate Christmas as best they could, singing traditional carols and writing to loved ones, hoping that the following Christmas might be brighter. In an improvised ceremony beneath the ruins, Fritz married his fiancée by proxy, perhaps expecting that he might never see her again. He was later reported missing, presumed dead. By this stage, Operation Blau had essentially failed. The oil fields were either destroyed or under Soviet control, Axis supply lines were at breaking point, and German forces were overstretched along a front exceeding 4,000 kilometers. Worse still, the Soviet troops Hitler believed defeated had remained in the field. They had been steadily gaining strength and were now prepared to launch a decisive assault against the vulnerable Axis positions, Operation Uranus. On November 19th and 20th, two massive Soviet pincers struck from the north and east of Stalingrad. A force exceeding 1 million soldiers, supported by 1,500 aircraft and 800 tanks, advanced against the thinly deployed and poorly equipped Axis Allied units. Although the Romanian troops fought valiantly, they could not withstand the onslaught, and Soviet tanks poured in behind German positions. With few reserves available to stop the advance, Axis forces were compelled to retreat. And on November 23 the Soviet pincers linked at the town of Kalach. The 6th Army was now completely encircled. Hitler's gamble to win the war had turned into a catastrophe. Here, we have a copy of the message Hitler sent to his trapped troops, attempting to raise their morale. In these difficult hours, my thoughts, and those of the entire German nation, are with you. The Führer assured his soldiers, everything within my power will be done to support you in your heroic struggle. However, the practical assistance Hitler could actually provide was far too little and far too late. Despite their weakened state, many German commanders wanted the 6th Army to attempt a breakout from Stalingrad. No such attempt was made. Hitler refused to relinquish the city. Instead, he arranged a Luftwaffe airlift to supply the encircled forces, and ordered a relief operation under Erich von Manstein to break the siege. Yet neither had sufficient strength or resources to succeed. When Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn, breaking through Italian positions, the German relief effort was abandoned entirely. As Army Group A retreated from the Caucasus, the 6th Army was left isolated and on its own. By the end of January 1943, the starving, frostbitten, and disease-stricken remnants of the 6th Army had no choice but to surrender. In a cruelly ironic twist, just as von Paulus prepared to capitulate to the Soviets, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal. When this gesture failed to inspire him to continue fighting, the Führer expected von Paulus to take his own life. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive before, but von Paulus refused. Although pockets of resistance inside the city continued for several more months, the decisive battle for Stalingrad was effectively over. Between August 1942 and January 1943, roughly 500,000 Axis soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in and around Stalingrad. More than 200,000 became prisoners of war, though only the fortunate, including von Paulus, would eventually return home. Soviet casualties were significantly higher, exceeding 1 million, with deaths accounting for approximately half that number. Around 14,000 Red Army troops, equivalent to 2 or 3 divisions, were deliberately executed by their own side, shot by security police units for cowardice or other perceived un-Soviet behavior. An estimated 40,000 to 45,000 civilians also perished in the city during the fighting. Stalingrad was the deadliest battle of the Second World War. Its consequences were profound, having a decisive impact on the course of the war, all to Hitler's disadvantage. It represented the peak of Hitler's ambitions in the East, after which retreat and defeat became inevitable. It also marked the emergence of the Soviet Union as a formidable military power, ready to compete with the Western Allies for the spoils of a defeated Nazi Germany. At home, Hitler's already fragile reputation as a brilliant battlefield commander suffered further damage. Even the public relations expertise of Joseph Goebbels could not conceal the disaster from the German populace. This failure became one of the key milestones leading up to the July 1944 assassination attempt against him. In reality, the odds had been stacked against Nazi Germany long before Operation Blau and the Battle of Stalingrad. The plan itself was extremely risky, and Germany lacked both the manpower and logistical capacity to execute it successfully. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were steadily growing stronger and, despite enormous losses, were able to exploit the German weaknesses. The entire campaign was another of Hitler's high-stakes gambles, the kind he had often won early in the war. But now he was increasingly failing, and at tremendous cost. At the same time, Germany faced severe setbacks on other fronts. Axis forces were decisively defeated at El Alamein, and major Allied landings in French North Africa set the stage for the collapse of Italy as Hitler's ally. Germany's war had become defensive, increasingly desperate, and moving toward a single, almost inevitable outcome.